Hi, I'm Michael Lenz, host of Beyond the Headlines. Join me on my next show as I sit down with Dr. David Karp, the director of the Project on Restorative Justice at Skidmore College, to talk about the global movement and the work that's being done right here locally. I hope you can join me. Welcome to Beyond the Headlines. I'm Michael Lenz. On today's show, we'll be discussing the Project on Restorative Justice being undertaken at Skidmore College. I'll talk with the director, Dr. David Karp, about this global movement and the work that's being done right here locally when we come back. Welcome back to Beyond the Headlines. I'm joined today by Dr. David Karp, the director of the Project on Restorative Justice at Skidmore College. He was the recipient of the 2010 Donald D. Gehring Award from the Association for Student Conduct Administration for his work on campus restorative justice. Dr. Karp has published more than 100 academic papers and 6 books. He is on the Advisory Council for the National Association for Community and Restorative Justice and the Board of Directors for the New York State Dispute Resolution Association. So, Dr. Karp, you've got a lot of experience in this area, and welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Yes, happy to have you on. Now, as we talked before we went on the show, I honestly, in full disclosure, I did not know anything about the Restorative Justice Project, and I understand from doing a little research that this is a global movement. This has been around for decades, and you've been involved with it for quite some time. So, why don't we start by having you share with the audience your journey into this world?
Yeah, sure. Well, 20 years ago when I got involved, I didn't know anything about it either. I got surprised by it when I was at a conference in DC. I was doing a postdoc and working at George Washington University, and I went to a summer conference that was hosted by the National Institute of Justice. And 2 of the presenters at the conference came from the Vermont Department of Corrections. And they were describing their brand new restorative justice program that they had just launched, and I became enamored with it. I loved their presentation, and then quickly forgot about it because they were in Vermont and I was in DC. Mm-hmm. But luckily, a year later, I got a job as a sociology professor here at Skidmore College, and looked at the map and realized that Vermont is an hour away. So I reconnected with the Vermont Department of Corrections and ended up working with them for a few years, studying their project, and that was the beginning for me. So what they were doing was confronting a dilemma that they had. This was in the mid-1990s when we were at midway through our mass incarceration movement. So mm-hmm. prisons were being built. More and more people were being sentenced for more kinds of crimes and for longer periods of time, and they had to build another jail. So they were in a fiscal bind. They didn't particularly want to do this, but they were getting all of these referrals from the courts. Mm-hmm. And so they embarked on a project to figure out what else they could do, and they actually did a market research study with the citizens of Vermont and said, do you want us to build a jail? Do you want us to do something else? And one of the options that they proposed was this restorative option, which was, they call it reparative probation. And the general idea is that a person is convicted of a crime, sentenced to probation by the judge, and the only condition of that probation is that they appear before a volunteer Restorative Justice Board. These are citizens in Vermont from the community where the person who was convicted is from, and they meet with that person to figure out what harm they caused, mm-hmm. What the person could do to repair that harm, and what they could do to reassure the community that they'll be safe and responsible going forward. So they'll invite the crime victim to participate in this discussion because they're in the best position to say how they were harmed and have a voice in what decisions are made, and they collaboratively decide what the outcome will be. And it's been very successful. I started doing the work with them, and then at the same time, our students at Skidmore were in a small uproar about our judicial process for when they got in trouble. One of the indications of their dissatisfaction was the number of appeals that were happening, that they would get some kind of sanction, be dissatisfied with it, appeal for some kind of change, and so they were requesting changes. And I was part of a small committee to look at our process, and I shared with them what was happening in Vermont, and we decided to implement something similar at Skidmore. So I've worked both in the criminal justice system and then also on college campuses.
So in the situation in Vermont 20 years ago, was that the beginnings of this restorative justice program? Had it been going on in other places? I know it's a global movement.
It's hard to pin down because there are so many different strands and branches and histories. So the first program in the United States actually started in the late 1970s. A guy named Howard Zehr, who was part of the Mennonite movement and a professor at Eastern Mennonite University, started a program that was a court-based program which involved victims meeting with offenders to repair the harm. And so it was small back then, and it's grown. So that's one legacy. Another is the Vermont legacy. A third comes from New Zealand, and that's a model that was called restorative conferencing. And a fourth comes from Native American traditions or First Nations people in Canada, and often the practices are around sitting in circle and using a talking piece. So there's a variety of practices, but they're all woven together by a common philosophy that the best way to respond to harm or misconduct is to focus on repairing that harm, that the obligations are for making things right. Rather than a more traditional punitive approach.
Yeah, and you had said in the notes that you had sent me, the approach to crime or misconduct that focuses on holding someone accountable by identifying the harm they cause and ensuring that they take responsibility by making things right. So it's definitely a very different mindset, philosophy, program than incarceration, for sure.
Yeah, we often talk about, there's a law professor in Australia, John Braithwaite, who talks about passive versus active accountability. And passive means I did something wrong, the judge gives me a sentence, I sit in a jail cell. I don't do anything to take responsibility for it. And restorative justice says, that's not a productive way of thinking about accountability, that really the obligation is on me to take full responsibility by doing what I can to make things right. So it's not as if we're saying hard versus soft punishment. We're saying it's a different way of taking responsibility. That's important. The other piece that is central to restorative justice is the idea of social support. So we're pairing accountability with the social support necessary for someone to be able to become responsible. So maybe they need treatment, maybe they need friendship, maybe they need some other way for them to strengthen their connection to the community rather than being excommunicated.
Yeah, that's a very important point. I want to get to that, and I want to talk about some examples as well. But let's take a quick break, and we'll come back and talk about that after.
Okay.
Stay with us. We'll be right back in just a minute. Welcome back to Beyond the Headlines. I'm here with Dr. David Karp. He's the director of the Project on Restorative Justice here at Skidmore College and has been very involved in this program for at least the last 20 years. So he certainly knows about this program, and glad to have him on the show here to talk about it. Dr. Karp, we were talking about the concept of restorative justice and how it differs from what people typically think of when they think of people committing crimes, the incarceration model, if you will. And there were some statistics that jumped out at me when I was doing some research that when we're comparing those two, you had mentioned in the first segment, we're not talking about hard versus soft, we're talking about a different option. And that a lot of people out there watching may think, okay, the typical model is that when somebody does something wrong, commits a crime, we put them away and they go away and they won't ever harm anybody or commit that crime again. But your statistics were that 3 out of 4 people convicted of violent crime will be arrested again. So it doesn't necessarily work the way it's determined to work. So tell us a little bit more about that and how restorative justice compares or stacks up against that incarceration model and some examples that you've seen.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that we have this idea that people are individually culpable, right, for their behavior. And that's a misunderstanding of how humans operate, right? We operate socially, and so we're influenced by our peers, we're influenced by the larger social world around us, and much of our behavior is in response to these larger social forces. And so to think of someone responding to someone purely in isolation and expect them to change is not very productive. So in other words, we arrest someone, send them to jail, they come right back to the community where they were before, and then we're surprised that they revert right back to the behaviors that they engaged in before. That doesn't make much sense. So without addressing the larger social world that people are in, we're not going to be successful. I mentioned earlier that one of the origins of restorative justice is in New Zealand, and it really comes from the indigenous practices of the Maori people. And from their perspective, the idea of the Western court, where you put someone, isolate them, and separate them from their families, friends, is kind of cruel. And it doesn't recognize that people need the social support around them to be successful. It also fails to recognize in its response, in terms of sentencing or punishment, that people are influenced by the challenges of life around them. And so their approach in restorative justice in New Zealand has really been to embrace the community, bring the community in to the decision-making process, and create systems of support so the person can be both accountable, take responsibility for their crime or misconduct, and but also be a productive citizen.
A lot of people, when they think of crime, they think on a national level, international level, they think of the most violent of crimes, the serial killer, for example. Are there circumstances in which restorative justice isn't implemented or would not be effective, in your opinion?
The research on restorative justice suggests that it's most effective with serious crime. And that's tagged to the idea of harm. Where there's clear harm and we can see it, then there's a role for trying to take responsibility and respond or address that harm as best they can. You can't, if someone murders another person, they can't bring them back to life, right? But they can be accountable for that. At least at the emotional level, like conveying true remorse for taking that life to the family. In restorative dialogues, for example, between family members of a murder victim and an offender, the family members might want to show that person a photo album, a family photo album that really conveys something about the life that was taken. And they really want to see that remorse. And that's part of the victim's healing process, which is so important. The centerpiece of restorative justice is responding to the harm and the needs of the people who've been most affected.
Some examples. I know you've had some here locally that you want to talk about.
Yeah, and a much lighter note than that. And I should also say that the first step in a restorative justice process is whether or not the person is accepting responsibility. And so you wouldn't go forward with a restorative justice process if the person is denying responsibility. And that's one of the biggest problems in our society right now, is that we push people to deny responsibility. Our punitive approach makes it logical for someone to try to avoid that punishment by minimizing or denying responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, we see that all the time. We'll see that on the news where somebody who, it appears to all practical viewers that there's been a terrible crime committed, and they'll walk up and say, not guilty, because they're told to say, not guilty. That's how the process works.
And that's very painful for victims to hear, right? When there's a victim of sexual harassment, given that we have a giant Me Too movement happening right now, a victim who knows it happened, hears the guy say it didn't happen, is further traumatizing. So restorative justice asks this question, what are the conditions that make it possible for someone to take responsibility for their offenses? And creating those conditions is the restorative effort. So I'll give you an example. again, on a lighter note, we had a student, I'll call him Sam, years ago, who he was on an athletic team, but his grades were so low that he was taken off the team. And so he was barely surviving as a student, but athletics were his life. It's what kept him connected to the school. He went to every game you could go to, not just his team, but other teams, women's soccer games, men's basketball game, you name it, he went. He would go with a group of friends. They were the biggest fans in the stands, but they would often go drunk, and they would often cross the line between cheering and jeering of the other teams, and so that was problematic. And there was a game at halftime when he got into a confrontation with a member of the opposing team, the team manager, that was more of a chest thumping, bumping kind of moment, about to erupt into a fight, and somebody pulled them apart. So there were multiple policy violations, right? The drunkenness, he was underage. Once you physically push up against somebody, that's an assault. You can get arrested. You can go to jail for that. So our traditional response, most people would say, is something punitive, like we should suspend him, or we should ban him from attending games. He should lose privileges. And that is a challenge when you realize his academic survival depended on his connection to the college, which was dependent on his participation in the athletics dimension, at least as a fan. So we had a restorative conference, and the first question is, who do you invite to that?
Sure.
And so we obviously invite this guy, Sam, and we invite someone who can be supportive of him, a faculty advisor or a friend. And then we think about who's been impacted or affected. So you invite the student who was on the opposing team. We thought more broadly, and the athletic director was important. And one thing she said, which was very influential, she said, "Look, Sam, I need you at games. We need your school spirit. You and your friends are our biggest boosters, and the team depends on it. But we can't have you." And that day, when I saw you walk in, I knew you were drunk, and I made the wrong call because I looked the other way because I wanted you in the stands.
I'm going to interrupt you for just a second and take a quick break because I want to hear the conclusion of this.
Okay.
So I want to kind of leave the cliffhanger for the viewers.
Okay,
So
good.
we're going to take a quick break, come back, and we'll get the conclusion of this example when we come back in just a few minutes. Welcome back to Beyond the Headlines. I'm here with Dr. David Karp, the director of the Project on Restorative Justice here at Skidmore College. Dr. Karp, we were talking about an example here locally that you've experienced with the gentleman you refer to as Sam the Fan. So we've kind of gotten to the point where you've seen an issue that's arisen that has to be addressed and doing it through a restorative justice process. So how did that turn out?
Yeah, so the main thing is that you gather the people who were most affected, and then you invite them to talk about how they were harmed and ask them what they need. And so the athletic director was one of the people that was most affected. And it was really a professional issue for her, saying, she made a judgment call that she thought was wrong. It was unprofessional to allow this guy who was drunk in. But she felt this tension between wanting to have fans in the stands and address his particular and his friend's particular behavior. So rather than doing what we would traditionally think of as a punitive approach, like banning him from attending any games, they negotiated their own solution. I would never have come up with it myself. You wouldn't see it on a list of options for sanctions or punishments. And they decided to make him this is what her request was, that he would become a student ambassador at the games. And what that meant was that she would meet with him before a game started. In other words, she would make sure he wasn't drunk. There was a little quick breath test.
Yep.
And that he was in charge of leading cheers and making sure that his friends were sober and appropriate, and raising the energy level. And he was so surprised and grateful because it's what he cared about, what he wanted to do. And I was thinking, this was spring semester, April, end of the semester. I was thinking to myself, well, logistically, how can this work? How many games are there? So I asked her, I said, well, how many games at Skidmore in these last 3 weeks of school? And she did a quick mental note and said, 48. I was like, really? So they arranged for 15 games. They worked out the logistics. He met with her and he came through. And so that he was academically successful. He finished his career at Skidmore well. He never got in trouble again. He was able to take responsibility for his behavior by not only changing it, but by providing him a leadership opportunity. He was able to transform his identity as someone who's trouble to someone who was very positive contributor to the community. So he did more than that to take responsibility. But the idea is to focus and customize for each situation.
Yeah, I was just about to say, I imagine every situation is different. And I suspect that the sooner you kind of implement this process or this mindset within students, the more effective it would be. And I know you have some programs even in the K through 12 school system. So tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. There's if there's any area in restorative justice that's experiencing exponential growth, it's in K through 12 schools right now. And so we're really coming off of the era of zero tolerance and moving towards a different approach. And part of that is a recognition that by handing suspensions out like candy, it's not productive for kids. Suspensions don't really do what they're supposed to do. When we separate a kid from school, we don't make them more excited about being in school. They fall behind, they feel rejected, and it's not the place for them. And so keeping kids in school, keeping them connected, but also making sure that the learning environment is a positive learning environment for all kids is the goal of restorative practices in schools. So part of that is foundational, meaning teaching kids how to communicate in positive ways with each other. So basic conflict resolution skills, basic skills in expressing what their concerns are. They came in from home and their parents had had a major battle and the kid's angry at school. It's a recipe for suspension or defiance with a teacher. But if the teacher is asking what's going on rather than go to the office, that shifts the relationship. So area schools are working on these community building, relationship building circles in classrooms, restorative conversations between teachers and students, and vice principals, who are the disciplinarians, are using restorative practices to address more serious infractions.
And some other statistics that I'd read, that restorative justice can cut reoffending by 83%, and that 98% of victims in restorative justice are satisfied with the results. So those are pretty good numbers.
Yeah, there are different numbers, different studies, different kinds of, different places, different kinds of offenses. But generally speaking, there's some positive findings in terms of reducing reoffending, and surprisingly positive findings among victims or harmed parties who really want to have a voice in this process, and it seems to meet their needs very well.
Yeah, and intuitively, just thinking about the process, especially in K through 12, you hear that a lot. We see that a lot with children, and that they're sent to the principal's office, they're sent to detention, or they're suspended. And again, it's that separation from the rest of the community that takes place. Doesn't really get to the underlying issue as to why that offense occurred.
It's a funny thing. We, of course, in our culture, when a kid gets in trouble at home, they get grounded. And the philosophy behind that, we don't often think about it, but the philosophy is we want to pull you back into the family, that you're somehow drifting away, yeah. And we want to tighten things up. We want you to reconnect you with the family and its values. But in schools, we do just the opposite, right? We push kids out. And maybe at one point that meant that when we suspended a kid, they were going to be grounded at home and reconnected, and they come back to school on straight. But now everybody works, and the kids at home on on their computers, and it doesn't serve that purpose anymore. So when we think about the purpose of strengthening the ties of a kid to school or a kid to family, it comes much more, restorative practices come much more into alignment with our values.
We've got about 30 seconds left. So what are some of the projects that you're doing at Skidmore as it relates to the project on restorative justice?
Well, we do some things on campus, but we also provide support to area schools in terms of training teachers and principals in restorative practices, and we do that on college campuses across the country who are looking to implement restorative justice. So mostly we provide training and coaching and technical assistance as projects get off the ground. We do research too, but there's more to say in 30 seconds. The primary thing is offering support to the community.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I really appreciate you coming on and talking about this, because as I said at the beginning of the show, it's something that I wasn't aware of, and certainly it's been going on for a long time and very interesting in terms of how it can help the process as we go forward. So I appreciate you coming on and talking to our listeners and to me about it, and maybe we'll get you back on so we can continue the conversation.
Well, that'd be great. It was great to be here. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate it. And you can stay with me for just a few more minutes and I'll be back to wrap things up. Thank Dr. David Karp, the director of the Project on Restorative Justice at Skidmore College, for being my guest today. And thank you for tuning in. Join me next time as I continue to talk with the business and political leaders shaping the headlines here in Saratoga Springs and the surrounding communities.